Okay, we're doing an improv video. This one is kind of following on from the abstraction philosophy video, which I think I'm going to keep it up now from now on, because I was wondering whether or not to publish it in the first place and then whether to keep it up indefinitely. For those of you that haven't seen it, it's a bit of a deep dive into my personal life philosophy, or rather an ideal that I try to strive towards in beliefs. It's about never trying to see things as one possibility and trying to absorb as much experience as you can so that you can see through as many lenses as possible, like as many lives as possible, as many experiences, so that you're not always closed off in a singular box that we describe as a perception frame, where effectively reality is like this wave function that collapses down into one experience. But anyway, in this video, we're gonna kind of move on to another belief I have. So we're kind of getting more into like the alien/extraterrestrial domain, but not exactly, because it applies to humanity as well. Again, it's just like looking at a fundamental pattern of the world and extrapolating it into the future. So we're going to talk about the impossibility of action for deterministic legal systems. All right, so this is related to what in Star Trek you might call the Prime Directive. So the Prime Directive, if you don't know, it's actually something which appears in different like science fiction stories, is where an advanced race has like a set of very strict rules for not interacting with other alien species, because, you know, the act of interacting with them fundamentally changes the course of their history, and you don't have a right to interfere with that culture. And it's an interesting idea, because as we'll talk a bit about the legal system concept, you kind of get an idea for, by you interacting, you're effectively causing an unintentional genocide, should we say. But most of it's just about potential, in the way that, you know, if a culture develops by themselves, they'll develop a vibrant culture of their own. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe it's a good result, maybe it's a bad one, but then again, rule one, subdivide the idea. We shouldn't measure everything by our own morals and ethics necessarily. Again, the default position of the universe is indifference. So technically, any idea, any moral system, whether it's good or bad to us, is allowed to exist in the universe. But anyway, that's what the Prime Directive is. It's basically saying, don't interfere. Like, let the aliens come to you and then like welcome them, introduce them to the system. It's more complicated than that, and obviously you know that Star Trek has like a massive lore base and fan base, so I'm sure someone will shed more light on it here. But again, like I said, it's like this trans sci-fi opera concept. So onto my idea. Now again, I say my idea is something that I did think about myself, or I think I thought about myself, but then again someone else might have come up with the idea as well. As abstraction increases in the world, so does our predictive capability, and this is just to go along with like technological advancements and the understanding of how the laws of physics work. What that effectively means is that your ability to predict things further into the future also increases. We can imagine that when, you know, quantum computing becomes a thing, we're able to like simultaneously compute, I don't want to say seemingly limitless number of possibilities, but maybe at the same time our ability to predict physical results will increase. What does that mean? Well, it might mean like better weather prediction systems, for example. That's quite simple. It would also mean that by measuring your entire body state, we could tell probably with quite a high degree of accuracy when you're going to die roughly, but again that depends on external variables, but meaning that it might be able to predict cancers before they happen, which is great. Or even just like see medical conditions before they start to appear in your body. That's effectively what prediction is. So again, extrapolating everything into the future with like Apple. I've got my Apple Watch, got my Apple phone. It takes in health data. They're developing new technologies. I can't wait for blood sugar measuring to come. Hopefully it will. So we're increasing the amount of medical data. We're also increasing computational ability. But the point is, like, medical prediction will be a thing, and therefore other forms of prediction will also be a thing. And if we extrapolate that even further into the future, a hyper advanced species, where any particular individual, if individuals are still a thing, will be able to conceptually visualize, should we say, how their actions impact the universe around them. For example, if I land on a planet with the beginnings of life, for example, and I plop a monument down on that planet, without even being there for the future, maybe I will have the predictive capability of being able to see how the entire ecosystem of that planet will develop and evolve into an intelligent species, and then how they will respond to this particular monument I've put down, and then how they will like build a religious system around that, etc. So without even being there, if you have this hyper-intelligent capacity for prediction, you might be able to see how things will go. And that raises some complicated ideas for legal systems, because our current legal systems do take into account some degree of prediction, right? So you have to be able to prove that someone's done something, but you can also prove the intent to do something. So for example, if, you know, you find like in someone's home or something, they've like constructed explosive devices, or they've got like a whole plan to murder someone or whatever, you can go, okay, that's intent to kill. So without the thing actually happening necessarily, we can take prediction into account for our legal processes. So here comes the thought experiment. If I suddenly had the capability of that hyper advanced alien species to predict how my actions would affect the world around me entirely, and you stood me on the pavement on the side of a road, I would suddenly be able to see by the cause and effect of the universe, how me just standing there changes every human that's ever going to exist in the future. Maybe not everyone, but I need to explain that a bit more. So the progression of life is a semi-randomized thing, right? There's an intent to create life through reproduction. It's not always intentional, but there's like an action involved. But there is a lot of like microscopic randomization going on. Well, I don't need to explain all the birds and the bees, but if there was no randomization in that process, then every child would be identical. They'd effectively be clones. So randomization in this way is a kind of deterministic outcome of everything that the male and the female, maybe in the future the male and the male, because it is technically possible to make a child from two males, but we'll get onto that science another time maybe. They've done it with mice. But anyway, through cause and effect, every action that's happened in the lives of both has led up to these two particular cells coming in contact with each other. Now there are all different types of things which go into that. For example, like the amount that's available for the male particularly. There's like a whole metabolic process going on with the body and every other process going on with the body. But then also timing is a thing, because out of all the millions and millions of possible cells, only one gets there. Again, there are going to be some exceptions to that. What this means, for example, that if on the day someone stands in the way of that guy on the pavement and therefore makes him have to spend 0.2 of a second more walking around you, then you have delayed that event and therefore changed the random outcome of that reproduction. Does that make sense? They're on their way to do something and then you move them even slightly, even just by standing there, you have changed who is born when the guy goes to, But this is something we don't think about, right? Because that's like so in the future, and it's like such like a personal thing that we kind of compartmentalize these experiences, but you don't realize like how just by existing on the side of the road, you're effectively changing who gets born in the future. Maybe that would be a bit easier to understand if I wasn't trying to like scoot around saying the specifics, but hopefully you still read between the lines. But it's more than that, because the birth of you and the birth of everyone that's ever going to arrive depends on every potential variable that's ever existed. It's not just you standing on the side of the road affecting how much time it takes people to get home. It's also everyone that's ever stood on the side of a road or a path affecting everyone else in your ancestry that ever tried to get home, for example. It's in war. If you have like a wave of people rushing to the front, it's which bullets hit which people. It's how they're affected by that circumstance, which gives them what kinds of trauma, which makes them more or less inclined to socialize with different people. Or it's how they're affected by individual words which are said to them, which changes their minds in certain ways and therefore changes how they walk or who they choose to speak to and who they choose to speak to. One person might have better hygiene than the other, so they feel a bit repelled, so they step back a bit. Maybe they heard some music at the same time, and maybe some music resonates with them better than others, so they spend more time listening to certain music, and somehow that changes the kind of people they want to interact with in the future. And it's like just so many intertwining variables that every possible action affects every possible person in ways that, again, on our kind of very limited prediction level, we can't see how all those tiny variables interact together. For example, if I move this paperweight from here to here, I have affected the final end state of the entire universe. Because again, let's just conceptually imagine this. Thinking about how like microscopic delays in time create like a ripple and further waves of change. Me just like moving this in a certain way or picking it up at a later time, at a later date, then delays me from performing other actions. And therefore, that delay is a change of a behavior, for example, of everyone that I'm ever going to interact with in the future and everything I'm ever going to make and put on YouTube. Slight neurological changes occur also because maybe my pattern recognition capabilities in terms of motor skills have developed enough where it doesn't cost me much effort to move this, but maybe I've never seen it in this position before, so the act of moving it here creates a new neurological link where I'm getting used to moving things on this side of the table, because that's how pattern recognition works. The more you repeat certain patterns, the more those neurological links are reinforced, the less effort it takes, which is effectively why you can go on autopilot when you're doing certain tasks. So every action you do also creates a neurological change, which effectively impacts your cognition. But also separate from me, if I left this here or outside forever, maybe someone else will pick it up and they'll get confused about it, but maybe let's just say it was left there until the end of human civilization. This thing still exists, it's still going to be interacting with the universe in its own way, even without me being here. Maybe if eventually an alien species come to mine the planet, they might come into contact with this and it will change a number on a screen somewhere for what kind of values of resources have been obtained from the planet. And maybe that will or won't make an important difference, but it will make a difference to the universe. Effectively, every possible thing that exists and every possible thing that can be done is interacting with the rest of the universe all the time. But this is also the interesting thing about seeing the universe as not a progression of time, but as all happening all at once. Because the past led this to being here. You just observed it. But also the future relies on where I put this. So this is a question of you can actually change the future. A lot of people feel like they're out of control. But if you can move something from A to B, then you still have purpose in the universe. A little lesson for people that are, depressed and feel like they don't mean anything. Even just by existing out, even in a homeless state on the street, you are still affecting which people are born, therefore which people live and die. But you're just cognitively incapable of seeing how all those tiny variables exist and how they interact with each other. But now look, I can change the future, because the future doesn't exist in the future, it exists today. All the atoms that make up the future exist now. Well, obviously heavier elements are still being forged all the time when we're splitting atoms, but you get the point. The energy which makes up the future exists today. So I can decide the future now by moving this. It's not some distant thing. It's all around you right now. That comes back to the whole concept again in the abstraction video about how you can perceive reality in different ways depending on how your language is structuring your mind. And that conceptually you might be able to create a language which doesn't see time as a linear progression like that, but as everything happening at once. And therefore, if you describe the future in a certain way and someone goes, well, how do you know it's going to be like that? The future hasn't arrived yet. You can say, well, I know that because I have agency. My language tells me that the future will be this way, so I just instinctively do this to make it that way. But anyway, let's bring it all together because we've gone on a bit of a tangent. So you can conceptually imagine that in the future, extrapolating out the potential of technology and just how cognition goes anyway, that we might be able to predict how our individual actions affect the world around us. Therefore, we'll be able to see how where we stand in the world, how we move, what we say to people, changes which people are going to be born in the future, given all the infinitesimal values, how these seemingly limitless variables affect everything, including the reproductive process. Therefore, certain people will be born, and some of those may have the families of their own, and therefore they will also interact with their own variables, and then that will decide who gets born for them, and then extrapolating that into the future, into millions, billions, trillions of people. If you could see that, then you have a choice. You'll be able to see that by taking a step to the left, or by taking a step to the right, you're effectively deciding which branch of billions of people get to exist. So if you were able to see that by taking a step left or right, you'd be making a whole bunch of people live and die, or a whole bunch of other people living or dying, then what do you do? Because if a legal system says that your intent to kill someone is enough to imprison you, for example, and if you could see all those variables, then you can't escape intent necessarily, because you understand that every action you do leads to the non-existence of people deep into the future. So if that was the case, what do you do? Well, the legal system, I guess, would have to change. I mean, does a legal system even make sense at that level of intelligence anymore? That is effectively a god-level intelligence, being able to know what will happen for every action. So it's something that, I mean, we can discuss it as a full experiment, but like not much else than that. Who knows what that would be like? Because for something like that to exist, all other areas of technology would have to advance as well, and therefore what a person is, what an entity is, will likely be very different. But let's just say that we did have that capability, and we did still care about the legality and the ethics about choosing who lives and dies, the trolley problem, if you like. Then I think really the only solution is to remove yourself as much as you can from the equation, to completely disappear, to try and remove yourself from every variable that affects everyone in the species. However, that's not entirely possible, as you know, because everything we do, just our existence, is manipulating energy in the universe. So if you wanted to remove yourself from even that equation, you'd have to remove yourself from the universe. So that does raise an interesting series of further questions, which is that if this trend has happened before, or will happen at some point in the future, if a species gets so advanced that they can predict how everything they do will affect everything else in the universe, do they have a moral or an ethics system or a legal system? And if so, what have they done to resolve that capability with that? And it's an interesting line of thought thinking about, intelligence and godlike capabilities. Because like we said earlier, it means that if you had that capability, you wouldn't need to interact with anyone or anything in the moment of time they're experiencing. If you could already see all the outcomes, then you know how to arrange everything to make anything happen. But again, this comes back to the Prime Directive, because if you could see how every interaction you can make with a species decides who lives and dies, then it makes sense that working on a legal system, you wouldn't want to interact with the species because you may effectively be causing a chronal genocide, I suppose, if that makes sense. Chronal time-based genocide, whereby speaking to one person, I have inadvertently made a new thread of human life disappear because someone that was observing me took longer to go home, and that changed their relationship with someone else further into the future. So again, a big full experiment, but maybe you found it interesting. If you made it this far, leave a alien or UFO UFO emoji or some kind of book emoji. Because like I said, it's not really like an alien-centric thing. It's also more like an intelligence-centric thing. And also we need to resolve the idea of like superpositions and wave functions with determinism, because like in the abstraction video, I spoke a lot about how, you know, it's a goal to be able to exist in a superposition of different beliefs. And it kind of connects with physical principles of the universe, quantum, should we say, where things aren't necessarily determined, but also that things can be determined because the laws of physics are consistent. And then I think there may be a bit of a discrepancy here where a lot of like scientists argue the universe is or is not deterministic. But again, I think that's a simplified way of seeing the universe. Something can be deterministic and non-deterministic at the same time. It just depends on what layer you're observing it from. For example, if you can't measure determinism in the universe, you might be able to look at it from the outside and say, oh, well, that was all predetermined because I have access to more information about the structure of the universe. So anyway, we'll leave it there. Have a nice day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.